Okay, so in terms of the agenda, actually, before I begin, thank you for joining us on this session. So it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're calling from the world. Um, Today, we're going to be talking to you about Estuary 101, specifically around ClickHouse as a technology, but we'll talk about, in general, what Estuary supports. So, this session's about to educate you more on Estuary, give you a flavor of what Estuary is all about, what our capabilities are. Um, and this will be followed by a quick demo of S3 so you can actually see it working in action as well. And if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to use our chat. If you have any issues, Dominic's on standby as well, so he can help sort these things out. And we will have a Q&A session very quickly just to answer some of your questions. So without further ado, let's begin and let's go to the next slide. So in this landscape, you guys will be familiar with the data integration space, and I've been in this space for I don't like to say how long, it shows my age, but let's suffice to say it's a very long time, and I've worked in ETL in real time data, and this is a common scenario that I've seen within organizations, even still to this date. You know, there's scenarios where the same company will have multiple solutions to solve their data integration needs, whether that being batch, another solution for streaming, another solution specifically around change data capture, especially when we talk about databases. And there's valid reasons for for change data capture as well. Typically, we talk about real-time use cases, but also, from an infrastructure perspective, that the impact on that of acquiring data from those kind of systems is very low impact as well. So there's legitimate reasons for using these solutions. But what we tend to see is there's different products, there's different departments using different things, there's different licensing. From a technical point and a commercial point, it's all like a spaghetti junction. It's just, it's hard to manage sometimes. And especially when you're negotiating contracts, you have to do, different vendors, different rules, different pricings, different mechanisms to calculate usage. So this is a very common, even like I said, to this day, I still see this in many organizations for different use cases. So why Estuary? I mentioned earlier on, the data integration space. We are as well in the data integration space. So what makes us different, to the problem that I stated earlier on? Well, Estuary is a single platform that, satisfies all your data integration needs, whether it's, you know, doing batch jobs, whether it's you need CDC, whether it's streaming, having mechanisms similar to what Kafka does. We can do all of that within the single solution itself. And again, I'll talk more about our architecture and what makes S3 favorable. We'll also look at deployment options as well. So for those of you that have sensitive data or stringent governance requirements or security requirements, there's options as well to satisfy those kind of requirements as well. So it's a single managed platform that does all those data integration requirements. Now, as a company, I tend to describe myself or ourselves as a new player on this block. It's not so new. We've been around now for 5, 6 years. Um, However, what I like to emphasize is the technology, because that's what's important, right? And the technology has been around for a very long time. It was actually used in our co-founder Johnny and Dave's previous company in terms of delivering market data to marketing agencies that subscribed or needed that data in real time. And through that endeavor, when it was acquired by Arbot, sorry, the company was Arbot, was acquired by LiveRamp. There was a great need that Johnny and Dave saw where data didn't derive from just marketing applications. There were financial applications, SaaS applications, databases is another common one where data tends to reside. And so that's how Estuary was born, to actually take data from, various different technologies. But more importantly, we'll look at the kind of connectors that Estuary supports. We have over 200 plus different connectors. And so this technology has been hardened over time to become enterprise grade. But one thing you'll hear, so I've mentioned the kind of different requirements, and I did emphasize on CDC to a degree, and talked about streaming and batch. But what we like to focus on is right time data. And so what does right time basically mean? Well, companies have different requirements. There's benefits, as I mentioned earlier on, to saying why CDC is effective, but it's not right for all use cases. Sometimes it may be batch. Sometimes it may be streaming. Streaming and CDC are completely different, even though they're regarded as real time. So different, sorry, not different organizations. One organization may have different requirements, different needs. And so when they want to get that data could be different from another use case or another department. However, aside from extracting data, delivering data may have different requirements, especially when we look at cloud warehousing, for example. We obviously talk about real time from a capture point of view, but do you really want to do real time on the target? Yes, there might be a use case if you're looking at real time reporting to have the whole pipeline real time. There are other use cases because you might be, sensitive to cost that you may not want to do apply real time data. You may want to do batch applies. So with Estuary, we have this concept of right time data. When do you want to acquire the data? When do you want to deliver the data? The whole pipeline can be end to end real time, or you could use a use case where you're doing CDC from a Postgres database, for example. There's benefits of doing CDC because not only are you getting real time, but more importantly, it's non-invasive on Postgres because you're just capturing changes from the logs, for example, or the wall in this case, Postgres. So that may be want to be real time. But however, the use case downstream, maybe going into ClickHouse, for example, maybe we want to batch that every 5 minutes, every half an hour. You can be very selective of how oftenly or frequently you want to apply that data. So that whole data pipeline can be a mix match, i.e., we capture real time but apply in batches. And so this is what real time is. It's giving you the control and power to say when you want to move that data, when you want to acquire it, when you want to apply that. And that's what right time data is. Now, having said the philosophy behind S3, let's take a look at the architecture. So I managed, I'm getting my words all wrong. So I stated earlier on about right time and having a managed platform, a managed service platform. The architecture is what makes us also different. I mentioned, again, referring to what I said earlier on in the open statement, that we do batch streaming CDC all in one single solution. But the architecture also makes us different, and I'll explain why. So we have three main components in this architecture. The capture, which as the name suggests, it will capture data from your source. And because we're right time, with some of these connectors, like Postgres, for example, you will have options whether you want to do real-time CDC on Postgres or do you want to do batch jobs on Postgres. And again, there are legitimate reasons why you want to choose one or the other. We're not saying that one is wrong. For example, batch, we know the pros and cons between batch jobs. We also know the pros and cons between CDC and certain platforms. So we give you that option whether you want to use CDC or batch. Now, once data is captured, and let's use Postgres as an example in this case, and we're using CDC, as I mentioned, we read the wall. So as soon as there's a transaction that's committed to the database, that's written to the wall, and that's when we capture that data itself. And once we capture that data, we do persist this into cloud storage, into collections. So this is a vital point. This collections in the middle is what differentiates us. And I'll come back to this point in just a little while. So we've captured in real time. There's a change that's committed on the database. We've captured it. We've persisted it into collections. This is cloud storage, and we recommend that you always set up your own cloud storage when setting up your Estuary account. And you'll have a section in the admin where you can set up your own cloud storage, and we support AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. So once data is persisted into cloud storage, you have the third task, the materialization job, and that's looking at incoming transactions that get persisted into collections in real time as well. And once we see data in there, again, we'll have options whether you want to apply real time with certain connectors or do you want to schedule this. And so the materializer will pick up that change and apply it into ClickHouse. Now, in this diagram, you can see there's various different technologies, and I'll come back to this point when we look at different connectors that we do support. The whole premise of this webinar is around ClickHouse, but there are other platforms that we do support. So looking at this whole data pipeline, capture, collections, and then materialize into the destination. As I said earlier on, that whole data pipeline can be real time, or you can mix and match, or it can be all fully batched as well. Now, come back to collections, because I did state this is a differentiator. So why is this a differentiator? Why do we have this bit in the middle where we persist the data? So one of the key reasons is that we can eliminate a single point of failure. So say, for example, ClickHouse goes down, it's out of our control, we can't communicate to it. That doesn't necessarily break your entire data pipeline. By having collections in the middle, what we do here is decouple the architecture. So materialized task obviously goes down because it can't communicate to ClickHouse, but your capture is not directly aligned to the materialize. Its sole purpose is to capture the data and put it into collections. So when materialize goes down, it doesn't disrupt your capture job. That still continues to process live transactions that hit the Postgres database. And like I said, we will persist this into collections. So while the materialization's down, there are checkpoint mechanisms built into Estuary to record each task's read and write position. So the materialize will have a checkpoint on the read position within the collections, and a write checkpoint to recognize the last transaction that was written into the target ClickHouse destination. So when ClickHouse does eventually become available, there is no manual intervention required to tell the materialize that you need to start from this point. Alternatively, there's no need to tell capture to go back in time because we've been keeping up with that live data. So the materialize will automatically look at the collections and look at the checkpoint to say, this is the last transaction that came in that we were last reading, and this is the last transaction that got committed into the destination. So because of these mechanisms, we have what we call only once semantics. So basically data is not duplicated or it's not lost as well. So we guarantee the delivery of that transaction itself. So that's a key benefit of having collections. It allows us to decouple the architecture. Additionally, it serves also further use cases downstream. Now, the collections, as I mentioned, is best practice. We always advise you to set up your own collection. So data is within your infrastructure. You can put your own security policy around it, but you can also put your own retention policy. So treat the collections as kind of like archive log files or a real-time data lake as well. So you can control how long you want to keep this. You could keep it for maybe 7 days, and because it's cloud storage, that you off put this into cold storage somewhere for, in case you have to replay transactions. But the longer you keep the retention policy, the more you can use it as backup file. So again, let's use ClickHouse as an example. We're replicating. For some reason, somebody's got into ClickHouse, they've been making all sorts of changes, deleting some records, and now you're in out of sync condition. Your source doesn't match your destination because some developers got and made some changes. Usually, typically, what happens in this use case is that with data integration solutions, you have to do an initial load job again. So you have to make the target back in sync. How do you do that? Well, you have to do a full load again. That's the only way to resolve this. And again, you could do that with Estuary. You could reset the capture to say, do a reset backfill. That's what we call our initial load jobs, and reload the data again. But I mentioned you can have collections, treat it as a real-time data lake or a backup files, logs, for example. Now, if you've got a long enough retention policy and you still have the data in collections, what you can do with Estuary's decoupled architectures, tell the materialization job to go back in time and replay those transactions instead of the source having you to do that. So the biggest benefit you're getting here is that you're actually alleviating the load or the burden on that source infrastructure to do the initial load job again, which can be very costly from an infrastructure point of view, because you have to do a full load on that source platform, depending on how much data you have in there. That could be costly from an infrastructure point of view, but also monetary as well. Managed solutions, they charge you for these kind of things. So having to go back to the source and, replay that data, you're paying a cost for that. So as I mentioned with Estuary, you don't necessarily have to do that. So that's the advantage there. That's the second advantage. Let's talk about a third advantage, which is one that's close to my heart and I like a lot because I see this use case oftenly. A lot of organizations may start off with ClickHouse as their kind of like centralized data warehouses for processing OLTP transactions. You may get a combination of someone using, both ClickHouse and Snowflake because they work slightly differently. They do different kind of processing. So it might be justified. You may have things like iceberg tables, which is a common one that we see nowadays. So what I'm basically saying with this use case is there's multiple use cases for acquiring that data and using it differently for different technologies downstream. And with Estuary, you know, I've spoken a lot about alleviating the burden on that source infrastructure. And what we can service with this kind of decoupled architecture is capturing that data once, but using it multiple times downstream. So we capture that data once from Postgres, we put it into collections, and now for the destination, we can have multiple materialization tasks, each with their own technology that needs to deliver data to. So we can have one materialization that's flowing data into ClickHouse. We can set up a second materialization job that reads the same data from collections and deliver that into MotherDark. And then maybe a third materialization where we're taking just a subset of some of those collections and delivering that into Iceberg. So you've captured that data once, but you've used it multiple times downstream as well. And that's another reason why this architecture differentiates from other solutions out there. We're not just a one-to-one mapping where if you have different requirements downstream that you have to set up multiple capture jobs on the same technologies on the source infrastructure. So again, it's this fan out, capture once, use multiple times, one-to-many use case that we can service. Now, I spoke about deployment options, and I spoke about how Estuary is a managed service. But we do give you flexibility in terms of, how do you want to use Estuary? Do you have strict governance and security requirements where data can only be processed within your sovereignty or within your region, for example? Now, the public, actually, before I talk about public, let's decouple this as well. There are two components in terms of how data works within Estuary. So we have what we call the control plane. So this is where you'll log on to Estuary and create your account and start creating your data planes. You'll start configuring, this is where I need to get data from. This is where I need to get data into. I need to monitor that. So I need some sort of observability and notifications and alertings and all that good stuff. So that's the control plane. Then the second point, what we have here is the data plane. So this is once you've created your data pipelines, we need to execute this. And data is processed through data centers that we have through Estuary's infrastructure, through several different data centers in the US and EU. Now, again, talking about these use cases where I said you might have sensitive data or strict governance around where data can be processed. If you do have that and you're not comfortable with using the public option where Estuary has data centers that may not be suitable for you, then we have these two additional options called private and bring your own cloud. And so what happens here with private and bring your own cloud is that a dedicated data plane can be created for you based on the cloud vendor of your choice and the region of your choice. So this isn't multi-tenanted, it's going to be single-tenanted dedicated for you as the end user. Now, the difference between private and bring your own cloud is who spins up the empty account for Estuary to do the good stuff that we do in terms of executing our code to build the data plane and giving you access to it. With private, it's Estuary owning that responsibility. So you tell us what cloud and region that you prefer, we will spin up that data plane. So when it comes to you specifying in your configuration which data plane you want to execute the data is, you'll see one specifically saying private data plane for you. So again, it's us taking on that responsibility, building the resources, managing those resources, providing all the upgrades as new iterations comes out, and giving you a dedicated environment. So that's what private is. Bring your own cloud is taking that one step further. Bring your own cloud is you having those resources. So you will create an empty account, and then you will give Estuary access to that empty account for us to deploy our code. Again, doing all the great stuff that you would expect from a managed service where we will maintain that code, we'll update it, patch it up for you. So again, it's still like a managed service, but it's using your resources. So you own that infrastructure itself. And again, all of this just to emphasize the point, whether it's public, private, bring your own cloud, it's Estuary that does the manageability. It's just whether you want a dedicated data plane, and if so, who would you like to spin up the resources to create that data plane? Hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, please let us know. And again, if you're interested in going more into a deep dive in some of the stuff that I've covered, happy to do follow-ups after this session. You can get in touch with us. In fact, we'll provide a slide in terms of how you can reach out to Estuary itself. Now, I mentioned earlier on about these different technologies, and we are focusing on ClickHouse as a destination, and I've mentioned Postgres as a source, but there's over 200 plus different connectors that we support today. And I've looked at the roadmap, and we continuously to add more new connectors in there. And there's some great stuff that we're doing right now that hopefully by the end of this year we can make some huge announcements on. But we do support a wide plethora of different technologies, whether that be in finance, in marketing, in databases, in HR applications. You can go to our website. We have a directory in there. You can do a search. But just a quick note on that. If you do a search and you don't find a connector in there, it doesn't necessarily mean, you're out of luck. There are options. If you speak to Estuary, that there are options that we can advise you, and there's some things that we're going to be introducing in the next couple of months that make that a lot easier. So again, if you don't see it in there, don't don't run away. Talk to Estuary. There's things that we can do to help that. Right. So having spoken about Estuary, giving you a flavor and overview, and talking about the capabilities, what makes us different, why Estuary, let's take a look at Estuary, right? So as part of this demo, I will be sticking with Postgres as my source. I will show you what the UI looks like, how it's configurable, what's involved in setting up a data pipeline from start to finish, and moving data into ClickHouse itself. Now, because it's a one-on-one session, I've taken the liberty of setting some of this up. We don't have to wait for processes to start up and whatnot, but I will explain what's happened as well. So having said that, before we go to that slide, let's have a look at the demo. Now, I mentioned on the source, I have Postgres already up and running. I have a schema in there. I have a table called movies, and I have some data in there. Now, the reason I explain this is because we've talked about, Estuary moving data, whether it's batch, whether it's CDC, whether it's streaming. But one of the things that Estuary also helps is it takes all the hard work away of you instantiating your target environment. So as you tell Estuary to set up for the first time, we can actually build the schema structure downstream, and we can also move the existing data you have from your source infrastructure and move that downstream into the correct tables, into the schema name that you provide downstream, and we'll have a look at some of those options, and move that existing data, and then automatically we'll convert that into, again, depending on what options you've chosen. If it's streaming, if it's CDC, we'll move real-time data. So I mentioned this because, like I said, I've taken the liberty and I've pre-configured this, so we've seen some data go through. So that's my source environment, and here we have my destination. And so originally, when I had set this up, I had 10 records, and you'll see from the timestamp that they all correlate with the same time. So these first 10 records was when I first set up the data pipeline from Postgres to ClickHouse. As I'd set that up and executed it, it went ahead and built the schema structure downstream and moved that existing data from Postgres into ClickHouse itself. Now, you'll notice that there's a record number 11 here, and it has a different timestamp. And that was just because you guys know, you've been in a lot of these webinars, when it comes to live data, live demos and live data, you always want to make sure it works. So this was just a kind of like a precaution from my end as a security, just to sanitize my mind, to say this demo is going to work for this webinar. So I just did a quick insert. So that's why you'll see a different time instance in here. Now, we'll talk about this during the demo itself, but there are options how we can present the data downstream and what options there are. So I'll cover that in just in a short while, in about 5-10 minutes time. So having shown you what source and target is, let's look at Estuary now. So the first time you start Estuary, all this will be blank. None of this will be there. So I've previously created stuff that I tend to work on. So you have this welcome screen. Again, from our website, you'll see sign up to Estuary. You'll click on that. It will ask you to enter some information, how you want to sign up. And it will also ask you for an organization name. Now, you'll hear different terms from this organization name. We also refer to it as tenant name once you get up and started. And so when I create this, I had Zulf-demo. That is my tenant/organization name. Anything I build from this point onwards will be under that tenant name itself. So from here, once I've created this tenant, I can invite other users to use the same tenant. I can create subtenants as well after this point. So if you have different execution environments and you don't want to put it under one main tenant, for example, you may want to create a UAT environment, pre-prod, prod. You can do subtenants in here as well. And I'll show you where some of this can be done as well. So that's your welcome screen. It gives you a high-level overview of all your tasks that are running, collections, what are active, how much data is being processed. And so the next phase is you want to set up your configuration. So in Estuary, that's a two-step process. Because of the decoupled architecture, we set up the source first, then we set up the destination. And this process is very simple. So when you click on sources, and you'll notice in here, the left-hand navigation pane, it's very much like our architecture that I described, that we have sources, collections, destinations. Those are the three main tasks. We also have admin in here, and let me cover admin. So I mentioned earlier on here, when you create this organization/tenant name, you can invite other users who can use this tenant name. So you don't have to have multiple users that create their own tenants. You can do this from one spot itself. So you create multiple different users, give them different accesses, different privileges. In here, you'll also see other tabs. So you can see billing if you go through the pay-as-you-go model. There are yearly subscriptions that you can also sign up to, and also settings. So you can set notifications in here. So when something gets breached in terms of getting an alert, you can send notifications via email, Slack. Cloud storage. So this is something that I emphasized earlier on. So by default, if you don't do anything, you'll use Estuary's cloud storage. We have certain policies around that. Like data retention is only 20 days, no more than that. But we always recommend, that's fine for testing. But if you go into prod, set up your own cloud. And this is where you can actually do it from here. And then, as I mentioned, if you want different storage mappings to different cloud environments, because you might have a UAT, pre-prod, prod environments, you can create different cloud storage for different environments in here. So let's go back to source and show you how easy is it to capture this. So let's start with source and let's see what technology are we interested in. Let's take Postgres. Now we'll filter this search and we'll show you up results based on the naming that we've given here. So here I can see all the different flavors of Postgres. And I've said earlier on, we also give you options, whether you want to do real time. So we've got this recommended, which shows real time, which is using the CDC connector. And then we also have batch. So we give you choice. It's up to you when you want to acquire that data. Now, if I click on capture here, what does Estuary ask me to do? Right. So first of all, we need to give this task a name. And then, like I said earlier on, anything that you create from this point onwards gets recorded under the tenant name that you create, Zulf-demo. So here I can give this, name as webinar, whatever. Let's just say demo 2, for example. In here, it's going to tell Estuary capture what data plane do you want to use to process this data. Now, as I mentioned, if you're doing the public SaaS offering, complete SaaS offering, you've got a choice of different data centers. Alternatively, if I'd requested private or bring your own cloud, that's something you can work with Estuary. We will build that up and give you access to it. So you'll see it up in here as private. So you'll see that data plane in there. I don't have private. I'm going to continue, one of the public data planes. Then, depending on what technology you use, you'll have different kind of requirements on how to connect to that technology. Now, from a database Postgres point of view, we need to enter the details of where that Postgres server resides. It could be on-premise, it could be on the cloud. Typically, with most CDC solutions, we tend to ask, or best practice tend to get you to create a dedicated user for Estuary that has specific privileges to acquire data from source. And so with that user, we'll put in the username and password to connect and tell it which database it needs to capture from. We have this thing called history mode. So again, this can help with data movement in terms of costs. Um, so let's take, for example, we have this primary key that we're interested in acquiring data for. And that same primary key has been updated 5 times with different values. What we do by default is we take the last update. So whatever's in the database, the last update that occurred, only that transaction gets moved downstream. So that helps with saving cost. However, there are certain scenarios downstream when especially in data warehousing, if you want to do things like slowly changing dimension type to referred to as, historical or audit tables, this is where you want for any transaction that we capture, we want a new row in the destination so you can track the history of all the transactions that have occurred. So if you do need that, then history mode will enable you to take all those 5 updates as opposed to the current update that we have in the final state. Different methods of how we can authenticate. We tend to use password, or there's other mechanisms as well that we can use to authenticate the user and the source. And then once you click on next, and for me to do this, I've already got this pre-configured. When you go next, it will ask you, right, what do you want to replicate from your source? And also by default, what we also enable is schema evolution. So a lot of the times when tools move data, they don't take into account structural changes. So by default, if something happens on the source that, maybe a new row's added, sorry, a new column's added, or even maybe a new table's added. Actually, let's use the new row because that breaks things as opposed to a new table where data won't be shown in the destination. So a new column is added, that will break the data pipeline. Now with Estuary, what we have is schema evolution. So we take into account structural changes as well as DML changes on the source. And so you can control this from here. If there's things like new tables you're not interested in, you can shut this off, or if primary keys are not a concern, you can disable this. But by default, we enable everything. So we take into account structural changes, and then we'll have a list of all tables. Now, for my demo, I just have the one table. But if you have tens, if not hundreds of tables, again, you can choose to replicate all of that by default, or you can be very selective and say, well, I'm only interested in some of these tables, for example. And so when you click on save and publish, what happens from that point is that Estuary will create that capture process for you, and it will start reading the data. So it will capture what the schema looks like, because it needs to create that schema downstream. And we also have schema evolution enabled. So it's always going to be monitoring if there's any changes to the schema. And then it moves the existing data across. And again, here you can get some high level metrics that you can do for monitoring. We also have an open metric API that you can use. So if you want to integrate some of these statistics into your own monitoring solution, you can also do that. But we can also click on that task to get more information as well. So I can look at the data that's been moved historically, not just today. We can go back in time over the last 30 days or change that for the last 6 hours, for example. I mentioned alerts. So here we can put some alerting mechanisms. Now you'll get alert for data processing. So if we set an interval of 1 hour and data hasn't processed in the last hour, we'll get an alert. You also get alerts for task failures. So if for some reason something goes down, you'll get notifications and alerts for that as well. We can look at the spec of this task. So again, this is working outside of the UI. If you want to use something like flow control, which is our CLI, you can look at all this in YAML. History of changes that have occurred on this specific task. So I can see something's changed today. And then we can also look at logs. And this is the first port of call for troubleshooting. So when things do go down, you can come into the logs and see exact details of what that error message is. And some of these error messages will also have a resolution behind it saying this, feature needs to be set, or feature flag needs to be set in order to help you move forward. So this is my first recommendation when, your task does go down. Come into the task, look at logs, look at what the error message is. Majority of the time, it will also have a resolution for you to bypass that error. And if not, we also have a great support team that will, happily jump on and assist you as well. So that's source. Now, once you've set up the source and it's up and processing, it's going on, it will automatically create collections for you. So as I mentioned earlier on, we persist this into cloud storage, and you'll see this in JSON format as well. So here it's also very good because you'll see a collection for every table that we actually start collecting. And in this demo, I just have the task that I called webinar. The schema was public from Postgres, the default, and the table name was movie. So again, clicking on this, I can get more information about the task, when it was last updated, when it was started, what data plane's been executed. But what I really love is the lineage that I can see, the connection between my capture job and my destination. Now, in theory, if you're doing this the first time, you won't have destination created. But if you do later on, you can see the lineage in here. So you can see it's been written by this source task that we've named for Postgres. But you can see that there's three materialization jobs that's reading from the same collection. So it comes back to this whole ethos I said earlier on, where I can capture the data once and use it multiple times downstream. But for this webinar, I will only have one active materialization. But I can see the lineage that there's other materialization jobs that's dependent on this capture job as well. And then the second stage of setting up your pipeline end to end is creating your materialization. And the process is as simple as doing your capture. So again, here you'll type in ClickHouse, for example. It'll give you some options. So we have a native connector, and we also have what we call a decaf option as well. So this is kind of like our back-end streaming capability, where originally before the native connector, we used a Kafka-like streaming to deliver data. Or should I say not Kafka compatible streaming into ClickHouse itself. So that's still available, but like I said, we've got this native connector as well that gives you a lot more flexibility in how data's moved. More importantly, I mentioned the schema evolution part, which is also supported in the native connector itself. And if I click on setting up the materialization, you have the same process now. You give it a name, data plane you wish to execute to. How do we connect to ClickHouse? But more importantly, now here you can start being a bit more specific about things that you want to do. And just for simplicity, I'm just going to go back one and go into my configuration to show you how we've gone about doing this. Now, in terms of default behavior for Estuary, we can present the data in several different ways. By default, what we do is something called soft deletes. So inserts, updates, they get replicated as is. When we see a delete operation, we'll process that delete transaction, but applying it to the target, we do something different here. We don't physically delete that record in ClickHouse. What we do is we add additional columns and metadata to indicate this column was marked for deletion. Here's the timestamp, and here's the op type that we record. And so that's not physically deleted. Okay, so we've got an error here, first time in the webinar. And that's not a problem. I've gone through this. I know what that error is. It's basically something sleeping on the back end. So we'll just wait that up. So that's the default behavior. But as you can see here, when we do connect, there are additional options in here. So we've got hard delete. Now it's taking that one step I mentioned around soft deletes, but here with hard delete, we're physically deleting that record in the destination. So that's the second way. There is a third approach as well, which we call delta updates. Now, delta updates will create a new entry into your destination, regardless of what the transaction's like. So if we see an update or we see a delete, we convert that into an insert downstream. So you have a new record for any transaction that's replicated across. There are also some additional options here. So here, again, because you're setting up the materialization job, you need to specify what collections you need to add in here. So you can see that we've got the movies already enabled. If there were other collections, maybe from the same database or different capture jobs, you can combine them into this materialization job by just specifying the collections of interest to you. In my case, it's just one-to-one. I can also go in here. Right now, that's kind of errored out, but you can also look at the various different columns and There's additional columns, metadata columns that we capture from the source that you can also add things like op type, as I mentioned. You can put things like source. So we'll capture the source um, task that it's been captured from, or the environment it's been captured from, the technology. So there's a lot of additional metadata that you can put into there as well. And also, how do you want to represent that data in the target? Do you want to copy like for like, lift and shift, where we copy the same schema name, table name? Alternatively, there's also options in here that can help you manipulate that. So you can say, nope, it's going to go into a different schema name on the target. And we basically go back to our default and what we've set in here as well. So those are all the options. Once you click on, yes, I'm happy with this, save publish, again, you'll have that connector up and running. And again, like the capture job, if you click into this, it will give you some metrics. You can view alerts for this task. You can look at the logs for this task. And again, you can see what it's been read from as well. So there's more information in here as well. So that's your end-to-end data pipeline. As I mentioned, it's a two-step approach, but it's very easy to create this, and you can be flexible in terms of, as I mentioned, use cases. You can have multiple sources going into one destination. You can have one source going into multiple destinations, or you can have multiple sources going into multiple destinations. And from here, again, in collections, you can track the lineage of what dependencies are between sources and targets. And so now that you've got the whole thing up and running, as I mentioned, the first time you do execute this, it will move the existing data over, create the tables, and then from that point onwards, you can start adding your change data. So in here, just to finish off this demo, and if I can move some of these things that are popping up on my screen from Zoom, what we'll do is add a new record in here. So I've got an insert. Let's quickly execute that query. Hopefully it hasn't gone to sleep. Yep, okay, that's all good. So now on the source, that should change. We should see record number 12. And then if I go back in here, rerun this, and we can see that new 12th record in there now. Don't know why ClickHouse has reordered this, but the point being here is you can see record number 12, and it was end-to-end real time that we've got this new record in there. Let me just rerun this again and see if it sorts. Yeah. Okay, it's still, for some reason, reordered it differently. But the point being, we can see that new record, and that was all real time. So hopefully, this has given a good overview of Estuary. It's given you, it is simple to set up. Hopefully you've seen the simplicity behind that, but also you can see kind of the flexibility that you get in terms of how that data is moved and what options you can set. You can do like for like, lift and shift. In my case, I've had different schema names, but I've copied over the table names. I've done, delta updates, which moves it in real time. And there's also other options that you can choose on how that data is presented. So having said that, let's go back to the slides and provide you on how you can get more information. If there's something that's touched nerve, that's piqued your interest, and what am I looking for here? There we go.
Yeah, there you go.
And swap present. There we go. So I encourage you to get in contact with us, and there's different methods you can use. So we do have a sales@estuary.dev email address. You can contact us via LinkedIn. There's a whole plethora of videos on YouTube with demos and webinar sessions that we also post in there. Slack is a great one as well. So if you go to our website, you'll see a Slack icon at the top. That will give you access to Estuary's public Slack channel, where we have a lot of information that we post on there. We also have, for people that want to do trials and they don't want to reach out to Estuary, they want to do things themselves. There's also a support channel in there. So if they have any questions or, run into things that they don't understand, they can also post in there. But my advice as well, if you want to do a deep dive into doing a proof of concept, do get in contact with sales and we'll walk through that whole process with you and make sure you're successful in doing what you need to achieve. Dominic, anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think that was great. Yeah, thank you so much, Zulf. This was a wonderful demo. I want to open it up for questions before we conclude today's session. If anyone has anything that popped up for them during the session, give people maybe a minute to think about questions, and then if there's nothing else, then we can give people the rest of their day back.
Wait, thank you for reminding me. I did mention in the beginning there was a Q&A. So absolutely, yeah, happy to answer any questions that you have. Hopefully, I've tried to make it as simple as possible, and you've got the gist. But again, if there's anything specific, happy to answer them now. Or if you'd like to get in contact with sales and have a one-to-one session, happy to do that as well.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat. So I'll give people a final chance. If there's no questions, yeah, like Zulf said, feel free to reach out to us at one of these links here. Our team is pretty responsive in Slack, so if there's something that comes up
Mm.
that you think of after, we'll have this video also recorded up on YouTube within the next couple weeks. So if you go back to it and there's anything that you're like, oh, I had a question, you can always reach out to us later too.
Yeah, I mean, we probably haven't been asked this question, but one thing I'd like to cover, which I didn't do in the demo, we try to keep it high level, like to keep it technical. One thing that I'll address if there's people still there listening about licensing, I mentioned high level very quickly. With some of the options we can do pay as you go. So that's based on a monthly, monthly fee that you only pay for usage. I would like to expand and talk about licensing a bit more. So you do have the option of monthly installments that you can pay, or if you want something that's a bit more predictable, we can also do yearly subscriptions. Some of the options around deployment. So if you do go around private or bring your own cloud, we only do yearly subscription contracts on those options. But public, for example, we do offer flexibility around pay as you go, which is a monthly fee, or yearly subscriptions if you want something a bit more predictable. And there is kind of like a ceiling to that as well. But if you're interested in pricing, there are two mechanisms that we use to calculate a price. And we, like I said, we try to keep things as simple as possible, something that's fair to our end users. And so when we look at pricing, we look at the number of connectors. So, the number of connectors you've got both in source and target, and the volume of change data per month, which could be in gigabytes or terabytes. And if you're going down the pay-as-you-go route, you can get a sense of your estimation because we have a pricing calculator on our website. So you can get a sense around that. However, if you go through the yearly subscriptions, again, you can get economies of scales through that. The longer the commitment, the bigger the volumes, the bigger the number of connectors, again, economies of scales around that. So again, your sales representative will help to give you a more precise quote, but those are the two mechanisms that we look at when it comes to providing a quote: the number of connectors and the volume of change data per month in gigabytes or terabytes. Sorry, Dominic, I thought I'd just add that out there very quickly.
No, yeah, that's great. Actually, we just had a question came in right at the end too.
Oh, good.
Can we batch the ingestion of CDC data with Estuary?
Can we batch the CDC? Not CDC. CDC by its nature, it captures changes as soon as it's committed into the database, right? So we will capture it at that point. What you can do once we've captured it and persist it into collections, you can batch it from that point onwards into your destination. But we don't do the batching of CDC from a source point of view. If you are interested in doing batch jobs, you can use the batch connector to do that from source. But my advice would be, if you're interested in batching, is do the CDC, because as I mentioned, it's not just necessarily about real-time data. It has an impact on your source environment where we're reading from the logs as opposed to the tables. So it tends to be minimal impact. In fact, when we talk about impact, it's always in single digits running in real time. So you capture in real time, but you do persist that, and you can tell your ClickHouse connector, if that is your destination, that you do the scheduled job. So you can pick it up in real time, but you apply in increments, in incremental batch jobs. Hopefully that answers the question.
It looks like if there's no follow-up question, I'll give it a second. Great. Yeah, I think that's it then. Well, thank you everyone for your time for joining us today. Like Solf said, yeah, please feel free to reach out to us afterwards if you think of anything. We will have this recording sent out to people. We'll also have available on YouTube. And yeah, keep an eye out. We'll have some new events announced for the next following few months for more chances to connect with us. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.